Good morning, viewers, members of the media. All the best for this new year, 2023. This is our first press briefing, press conference for the new year. I have with me colleagues Julian Robinson and Senator Peter Bunting, who will be speaking in due course on issues which they cover from a portfolio perspective. I wish to touch on the issue of constitutional reform, which has been in the news this week. Jamaica has gone through a process of the development of constitutional reform proposals in the 1990s and the first decade of this century, this millennium actually, which resulted in bipartisan agreement on a number of issues. However, the only major reform thus far that came out of that process was a very important reform of the Charter of Rights being inserted into the Constitution in 2011. It replaced what was there before, which was the 1962 Bill of Rights in Chapter 3 of the Constitution. Of course, there's therefore a lot of unfinished business when it comes to constitutional reform. And we, in the People's National Party, are anxious to see progress in this regard. One of the major items is to do with completing the circle of our independence. That is the decolonization of Jamaica, which began in 1962, but was incomplete. And it was incomplete primarily from a political perspective and a constitutional perspective as a result of two things. Firstly, the British monarch remains our head of state, so that Jamaica, as an independent country, has as its head of state a foreigner, somebody who lives across the Atlantic, somebody with very little connection to Jamaica. And secondly, our final court of appeal is Her Majesty's Judicial Committee of the Privy Council. That is a court that was established in the 1830s, I believe, a colonial institution, the judges of which are, for the most part, English judges. Now, we're not questioning the quality of those judges, but it is very unusual for an independent country after 60 years to continue to have as its final court of appeal a foreign court, a court that it had nothing to do with in establishing it, and which is largely manned by judges that have very little to do and very little experience of this jurisdiction. The Caribbean Court of Justice was set up 15 years ago or thereabouts with Jamaican input. It was designed to ensure its independence from political interference. It was established with a trust fund, which Jamaica made its proportional contribution to by borrowing money along with the other countries that set up the CCJ, the other regional countries, and putting the borrowed money into that trust fund and paying back the loans. The judges are appointed by a regional judicial services commission, which is established to ensure that the best quality and most independent judges are appointed. In the 15 years since the CCJ was established, it has built a track record of excellence, which has been internationally recognized for the quality of its jurisprudence. We believe that it is essential for the Jamaican people to have the benefit of a final court of appeal, which is accessible. Currently, in order to travel to the United Kingdom, if you have an appeal before the Privy Council, you need to have a visa. A visa is not available to Jamaicans as of right. It is a discretion which has to be applied for. You have to pay quite a large sum of money to get it, and you have to go through quite a tortuous process to get it. As a result, together with the enormous costs of fighting litigation in the UK in terms of travel there, accommodation there, and the costs of UK solicitors who are the Privy Council agents there. Very few appeals are currently going each year to the Privy Council from Jamaica. That is reflective of two things. First of all, it is denying the people of Jamaica, especially the ordinary Jamaican citizen, his or her right to have due process and access justice at the highest level when they have a matter which they feel ought to be tested before a final court of appeal. It also is stymieing the development of our legal profession, because our legal profession, for the most part, is unable to have an active practice which involves regularly appearing before our final court of appeal. The Caribbean Court of Justice, on the other hand, has the power to move from island to island to hear appeals. Indeed, when Shanique Myrie was denied access to Barbados and took her matter to the CCJ under the Treaty of Chaguaramas, the court came to Jamaica to hear the evidence. And we know Shanique Myrie got justice, including a payment from Barbados to compensate her for the wrong that was done. So, in addition to that, the CCJ uses audiovisual communication technology as a standard part of its operating practice. So you don't have to travel there for many of the processes before the court. You can do it from your home jurisdiction. We are saying, let us decolonize once and for all the legislation to move away from the Privy Council and to adopt the CCJ has been developed. It was developed under my watch when I was Minister of Justice and tabled. It was passed in the House of Representatives at the time, but the opposition at that time didn't see fit to support it in the Senate, and it couldn't pass without their support. So that legislation exists and can be dusted off and tabled again, and we can move forward in a bipartisan way on both issues, ensuring that Jamaica has a Jamaican head of state, somebody from our country as our top member of the executive, and ensuring that our final court is an institution that serves our region, that we help to finance, that we help to design as Jamaicans, and that has achieved a reputation for excellence. The government has indicated that it wishes to establish a committee to look at constitutional reform issues. I do not have a problem with that, although I'm concerned about further delays in achieving agreed positions. But we are willing to participate by nominating representatives to that committee. However, before I do so, I want to know exactly where the government intends to go on two very critical issues for the Jamaican people. First of all, the government has indicated that one of the things they wish to see that committee do is make changes to the Charter of Rights. As I've said, the Charter of Rights was enacted in 2011 with bipartisan support after nearly 2 decades of work. I've asked the government to indicate to me in writing what they intend to do in relation to the Charter of Rights. What are the issues that they would like to see changed in the Charter of Rights? I am not aware of what their position is on those critical issues, and I would like to know what those are at the outset so that we can prepare ourselves accordingly and, if necessary, have preliminary discussions, party to party at the highest level, to try to achieve consensus on those where consensus is possible. Secondly, the government has indicated to me that the referendum, which will be necessary to move from a monarchy to a Jamaican head of state, a republic, will also include other issues amending the Constitution. Now, a referendum is only required to amend deeply entrenched provisions of the Constitution. We have no idea, we have not been told, which provisions the government is intending to amend by way of the referendum process. We have asked them to give us full and transparent disclosure, so we know where this committee, from their perspective, is being taken And what is the journey that we are embarking on? We will not proceed without our eyes fully open, with full and transparent disclosure, so that the process can be respectful, collaborative, and productive. Thank you for listening. I will now invite Member of Parliament, Julian Robinson, Shadow Spokesperson for Finance, Planning, and the Public Service, to address you on issues relating to the public sector restructuring process. Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning to members of the media. Good morning, Jamaica. The opposition continues to have concerns about the public sector compensation review. The first concern we have relates to contract workers. Those are public servants who were engaged on contract by the government who are being excluded from this process. It is important to note that none of these workers chose to be on contract. In all of these cases, that was the only form of employment that was provided to them when they signed up. They have been excluded. They have not been given the retroactive sums, nothing whatsoever. We believe this is discriminatory. It's discriminatory because you may have two workers in the public sector, one on contract, one who may be considered permanent. They're doing the same job in the same department, and one is treated in a particular way, benefits from the compensation review, and the one on contract doesn't. There are thousands of employees within the public sector who are on contract and who have been left out of this process. We have raised it before, and we're calling on the minister and the ministry to address it, to deal with it expeditiously, because there is likely to be industrial relations restiveness if those contract workers do not believe they are being treated fairly. And at this stage, they don't. We have other concerns about the process. The public bodies have not been engaged in this process up to now. And by public bodies, we're talking about statutory organizations like the National Housing Trust, the National Water Commission. They don't know what this process means for them. And there's a great degree of anxiety and apprehension among employees within the public bodies about how the compensation review will affect them. And while the government has signed up what I would call most employees in the central civil service, there are a number of critical agencies that have not come on board. And what do I mean by critical agencies? I'm talking about like the fire brigade. I'm talking about the correctional services. I'm talking about air traffic controllers. Those critical agencies are yet to be brought on board in the compensation review. And the two big ones that remain outstanding are the teachers and the policemen. And I would like to know, what is the proposed time frame for us to complete those negotiations? Because those two bodies are critical to the development of the country. Certainly the police officers feel a great sense of demotivation right now. They don't have adequate resources to even do the basic responsibilities that they have. And they don't believe that up to now they're being treated fairly or they're being recognized for the sacrifices. And the sacrifices we talk about are every single day they go out there, they put their lives on the line to protect the citizens of Jamaica. Those important bodies need to be dealt with urgency and with equity so that we can complete this entire process. So while we have made some progress, the outstanding institutions remain an area of concern. So we would like to see, the minister has indicated that he wants to complete this before the end of the fiscal year, which is March 31st, so that retroactive payments can be made. Based on some of the utterances and the feedback that we have seen from some of those union leaders, we seem to be a far way away from successfully completing this exercise. There are some other questions I want to ask the minister. There is a public sector pension fund, which is to be established, and I would like to have an idea of the time frame for that, now that the government contributes and individual employees are now required to contribute to that fund. When that fund is going to be established, what is the management of that fund going to look like? And then on a slightly unrelated note, but also under the portfolio of the Minister of Finance, we had a great launch last year of the census, I believe in August. We had a census day in September. I know people were trained, people were provided with devices, but for some reason, we haven't seen the activity on the ground. Some of the persons who have been trained have decided to go back to their day job because they haven't heard anything. And the activity that we expected to see of census takers being out across the country gathering data, we haven't seen. So I'd like an update and a status on where we are with the census. But overall, we continue to have concerns about the public sector compensation review. We still want transparency in terms of what people, there at this stage, there are still groupings who do not know what the compensation review will mean for them. There are concerns even now with traveling officers because a significant part of their compensation was in allowances, which are now going to be taxable. We saw a circular come out maybe last week, which indicates that there'll be a one-off payment to traveling officers reflecting 10% of their annual accumulated allowances. So even among traveling officers, there is still some disquiet about how the overall compensation review will affect them. So those are the concerns we have, and we hope that the government will address them with alacrity so that we don't go into a situation where there's restiveness within the sector. Thank you. I'll now invite,
Thank you very much, Julian. Before I invite our next speaker, I just wanted to add one more thing, which is to do with the issue of the way in which states of emergency have been used in Jamaica since 2017-18. As you know, the opposition has had major concerns with the way in which states of emergency have been deployed over the last 5 or so years, both from the point of view of the fact that we don't think that they are a sound plan for dealing with Jamaica's very serious crime problem, because it is not a policing measure, it is a detention measure. It doesn't involve any investigation leading to prosecution and accountability for criminals. Rather, it kicks a can down the road by temporarily detaining people, which doesn't in and of itself result in any permanent punishment of any kind for those individuals, and they are generally released once the state of emergency comes to an end. And we have seen over 5 years, very few people being charged as a result or arising out of the detention that they may have suffered. And furthermore, the vast majority of those detained are never charged, and that their lives are seriously disrupted. So the efficacy of it is questioned, and is questionable, and is in fact not at all apparent to us. Furthermore, the police in particular are extremely, the rank and file officers are fed up and demotivated by the role that is expected of them in states of emergency. Long periods of sitting down at checkpoints, achieving very little. Often where crimes are committed relatively close by, but they are not authorized to leave their post to address it. The long traffic delays that these checkpoints have been causing, and so on. So that is all part of the matrix. And then, of course, there's a constitutional issue. The state of emergency was always conceived from independence onwards as a mechanism which is the last resort of the state to protect itself from being subverted and overthrown in a crisis. Jamaica has a long-standing crime problem. It is a problem which all Jamaicans, well-thinking Jamaicans, want to see effective measures brought to address. The opposition has some good ideas as to how to tackle that comprehensively and holistically. The state of emergency cannot be a tactic for policing. It was not designed as such. The Constitution does not permit it to be used as such, in our view. I have indicated that we will be taking this matter to court for an advisory ruling that can guide Jamaica, not us, not the Jamaica Labour Party, but the entire society, as to the correct parameters of use for states of emergency. I note that the Prime Minister at his last press conference on the 28th of December indicated that he would be engaging in Vale Royal talks with us to discuss states of emergency. In response, I said publicly that I thought that any such talks should have a much broader remit than just states of emergency and take into account other crime-related issues, such as how we deal with youths at risk in this country and the need for a comprehensive national program to address that, which is the source of much of our problems. Other issues around legislation focusing on enabling the police to build cases against persons who are known to be dangerous, violent criminals threatening life by taking them off the street and having a court-supervised process while the case is being built within a finite period of time. We've also talked about the diaspora being engaged in a more meaningful and respectful way to assist with the crime problem that we have. And they're very willing and anxious to assist in that way. These are some of the issues that I have said ought to be included in those discussions. However, we're nearly halfway through January, believe it or not, and I have heard nothing from the Prime Minister's office about any Vale Royal talks. I think that this is something which needs to happen urgently, and I'm calling on the Prime Minister, pursuant to the commitment he gave the people, to let us convene those talks so we can try and find common ground. Thank you. At this point, I will ask our spokesperson for national security and former Minister of National Security, Senator Peter Bunting, to address you.
Thank you, of the opposition. I just want to make 3 points this morning. First of all, since November, there's been lots of talk about SOEs working. And it is really just a perpetuation of the big lie that the government has been promoting for the last 5 years or so. Essentially, they continue gaslighting the public with the fallacy that if they want police and soldiers at saturation levels in their communities to ensure their safety and security, they need a state of emergency. That fundamentally is the big lie. What's interesting, if we want to just look at the statistics that are absolutely contrary to the assertion that SOEs work, we can look at what was happening last year. The year started off badly. There was a spike. In fact, you might recall that the leader of the opposition had put the commissioner of police on probation, I think it was, at our January press conference. And when the government finally accepted the recommendation that had been made to install ZOSOs in key areas like Central Kingston, we actually did see mitigation and a reduction in violent crimes through the first half of the year. By the summer, it had started picking up again. And that resulted in 2022 ending up with 1,498 murders, the highest number in 5 years. The silver lining, however, was that while murders peaked, the rate of murders peaked about August, September, there was a decline towards the end of the year. And what caused that decline? What precipitated that reduction? Well, in September, the GSF launched Operation Relentless. And this was supported by the 300 additional recruits that graduated from the police training college in that month. By November, an additional 200 plus had been added. So you had 500 plus additional police personnel in the field during the last quarter of 2022. That had an impact, and you see a sharp downward trend in the daily or weekly murders since September. Now, this is something that we have been advocating for in CMOC and publicly for a number of years, that the JCF needed 2,000 to 3,000 additional regular officers to increase the force strength to a level that the divisional commanders would have adequate resources at their disposal. And in a sense, this has vindicated these recommendations. However, what we saw is when it was spotted that there was this significant downward trend towards the end of the year, they said, but hold on, this is happening without states of emergency. Like a wagonist, SOEs hopped on to the downward trend and then tried to claim the reduction as being caused by SOEs. This is absolutely not true. And there have been some manipulation of the statistics to try and suggest that is so. And I can deal with that in more detail at another time. But if we just look, from week to week and even month to month, there's a certain randomness in how violent crime occurs. So if you want to measure the effectiveness of something, you need to look at it over a longer period of time. And if we look at, for example, murders in Jamaica since 2008, what we'll see is that after the 2010 Tivoli operation, murders stayed within a band of 1,100 plus or minus 10% for the next 5 years, and only started to increase in 2016 when there was a change of administration. In fact, the big anomaly was in 2017 when murders spiked up to 1,647. What were the reasons for that anomaly? What was the reason for the very poor performance? Well, the mobility of the police was seriously compromised. The government had pursued this ill-advised strategy of used cars for the police, most of which never arrived, and the police mobility was severely compromised. That, in addition to much interference in the operation, much political interference in the operation of the police force. And that was a disaster year. That is the year, however, that anomaly is the year that the government chooses to use as the base for comparison of subsequent years to make the case or assert the case that the SOEs work. When in fact, if we look at just the average annual murders in Jamaica, we look at periods when there were SOEs and no SOEs. In 2008 to 2011, of course, there was one very notable SOE, an SOE which we supported for 2 extensions. During that 4-year period, the average annual number of murders in Jamaica was 1,471. In the period 2012 to 2015, with not only no SOEs, but a dramatic reduction in the use of curfews, went from thousands per year to a few dozen per year. We average 1,129 murders per year. Still not ideal, not holding that up as any target, but just the statistics show it had dropped by 300 and odd murders, almost by a murder a day reduction. 2016 to 2019, again with 2 almost full years of states of emergency, the average was 1,408, back over 1,400. In 2020 to 2022, those 3 years, the average 1,435. Again, an average of over 300 murders per year, greater than the 2012 to 2015 period. So in these years where states of emergency have been used, and sometimes continually, we see the outturn of the average annual number of murders being 300 plus greater than in years when it was not used. How on earth can the government credibly assert that SOEs work? It does not, certainly not on a national basis. The second point I want to make was that in the 90s, the Jamaica Constabulary Force Act was amended to make a clear separation between policy and operations. And I'm concerned that the continued public advocacy by the Commissioner and members of the High Command, especially after Parliament has decided against it. This was the case both in November 2021 and again in 2022. I believe that the continued public advocacy for states of emergency after Parliament had decided is wrong. This violates that important separation between policy and operations. And it risks pulling the JCF into the arena of politics. It is inappropriate, in my view, unprofessional, and risks taking us back to the days of JLP and PNP police. I call on the Commissioner to stop it. It is unprofessional and it is not in the long-term interest of the JCF. And quite frankly, it's inconsistent with the law. So in closing, I want to reiterate something we've said repeatedly. There are multiple strategies along two tracks that, if pursued consistently, will yield a sustained reduction in violent crime. The first has to do with crime control, which tends to be where all the focus goes. But in the short term, if we address putting more boots on the ground, training more police personnel, increasing the force strength so that there are more resources to be deployed by divisional commanders, that is good. Second, we need to deal with the welfare and compensation issues of the rank and file as a matter of urgency. It is working now to demotivate and demoralize the same people that we are relying on to go out there to serve and protect the public. But importantly, in the long term, is the crime prevention issues. It is the social investment in the communities that tend to generate most of our violent crime. We need to invest in the schools, we need to invest in our social workers, we need to invest in both the social and the physical infrastructure to reduce the criminogenic nature of the environment in which so much of our children have to grow up today. That is how we should be deploying these budget surpluses that we're boasting about. Having money in the bank while your children are hungry or not properly clothed is not successful from a family's perspective. And similarly, I say, having a budget surplus is not an end in itself. It must be invested in our people so that we cut off the fuel that is supplying young people for gangs, supplying recruits for the gangs. And that is the only way in the long term to sustain reductions in violent crime. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, Senator Bunting. I'll ask both Julian and Peter to join me at this point. And is there going to be an opportunity for questions? Okay, so go ahead, Al Edwards, journalist.
Thank you for that question. What we have seen is more financial resources being put into the Ministry of National Security than ever in history. In fact, I recall in 2015-16, which was the last budget year that I was minister, we had just under 2 billion rather, in a capital budget for the Ministry of National Security. At the time, the capital budget for the Ministry of Education was about the same. Fast forward a few years, the capital budget for the Ministry of National Security had increased tenfold. it was at 20 billion. The capital budget of the Ministry of Education was still at the just about 2 billion. And so there has never been more resources available to the ministry than there is today. And there has been also a very significant increase in the current budget as well, not just the capital budget. So we don't think it is a shortage of resources. I could only have dreamed of the scale, of the quantum of resources that the current minister and the commissioner and the CDS have at their disposal. But notwithstanding having so much more resources, the results have been very disappointing.
And I would just add to that, you know, that it is an indictment on the performance of this government that despite the fiscal space that has been created by the successful execution of the IMF programs between 2013 and 2017 and thereabouts, which has led to much stronger revenues, better revenue collection, and more resources that can be devoted to critical issues, social investments, national security, and so on. The bigger budgets given to the National Security Ministry have actually resulted in much poorer outcomes, poor performance. The government has failed dismally in managing the safety of our society. And this cannot continue. The Jamaican people will hold them accountable for it because safety and life ultimately is the most important thing that any government must guarantee its citizens as best it can.
Okay, I see a question here from Siobhan Campbell from Nationwide News. It's to the opposition leader. What are your specific concerns regarding a review of the charter? For example, are you concerned the government may seek to undo the 2/3 majority requirement for SOE?
Thank you, Siobhan. I don't know what the government intends to do. So as far as I'm concerned, it's kind of open season. We have a former Attorney General, current Minister of Legal and Constitutional Affairs, who has made a number of very poor decisions over the last few years around NIDS and other matters, and has indicated that as far as she's concerned, it is sometimes necessary to abrogate and abridge constitutional rights. In that context, I want to know if I'm going down a road with them, what is the direction of that road? Where do they wish to carry us? I do not know what their intentions are. I know that they have felt frustrated by the resilience and determination of the opposition to stand up for the rights of the Jamaican people, whether it be on the issue of states of emergency, on the issue of NIDS, which Julian Hare brought the proceedings in his name, which resulted in the NIDS legislation being struck down in its entirety by the Constitutional Court. And the government had to wheel and come again and recast that legislation in a way that addressed the issues which we had been saying all along had to be fixed for that legislation to move forward. I don't know where they're going, Siobhan, and I'm not willing to go down there blindly with them. I don't have that kind of confidence in them when it comes to the Constitution.
All right, I see a question here, a follow-up, it seems, from Siobhan. If the government decides to move forward with the CCJ, is this a deal breaker in terms of your support for republicanism?
I assume you mean if they don't, if they decide not to.
He said apologies, without. If the government decides to
yeah.
move forward without the CCJ.
As I've said, and I will continue to say, both issues ought to be dealt with at the same time, not in this piecemeal fashion. Jamaica must decolonize once and for all. We are a proud people. We are a people with a past coming out of colonialism and slavery, and we need to stand up on our own 2 feet and be responsible for our destiny. And I have confidence in the Jamaican people that we can do that if we make the right decisions. Both issues must be addressed at the same time. In terms of whether I would say we won't proceed with one without the other, I reserve judgment at this time on that issue. And I'm not prepared to say what our position will be, because quite frankly, we have not collectively addressed that within the party. But as far as I'm concerned, and I believe the party fully supports my position on this, There must be full decolonization now. We must give our Jamaican people, especially ordinary Jamaicans, rights of access to their final court of appeal. We must have confidence in ourselves and the institutions that we have designed and built and financed. And both issues should be addressed together. And that is the position we will be maintaining. Thank you. Al. That's a really good question, Al. And obviously it's a bit of conjecture. Yes, yes. And you know, there are Barbados is a republic, Guyana is a republic. And so yeah, there's very few countries move to have away from their colonial past into having their own head of state and seek to have their judiciary managed at the highest level by some foreign body. It's bizarre. And I believe that the rationale from their perspective is that Mr. Seaga continues to have cast a long shadow over their thinking. And he was always reluctant to go down the road of a Caribbean Court of Justice. It's ironic because the idea of having a Caribbean court as our final court after the Federation collapsed, that idea originated with Hugh Shearer at the very beginning of the 1970s when he proposed it as leader of the Jamaica Labour Party. But somehow along the journey, Mr. Seaga was turned off. And indeed, and I must credit him for this, his skepticism and concerns resulted in belt and braces measures being put in place in the design of the CCJ to meet those concerns. Some of the things I've already spoken to today, the trust fund to ensure that the CCJ doesn't rely on any budget from any country to have adequate resources to fund its operations. This Regional Judicial Services Commission, which sets out very clearly how judges are appointed and keeps politicians out of that process. These were part of the design that sought to meet his concerns. And I'm glad that those were done. As to why today the Jamaica Labour Party is not yet ready to embrace full independence, I don't understand it. They haven't articulated that. I believe, you know, there's some within the party that would go the route of the CCJ, and there are some that are wavering. I don't think they have achieved consensus over it, but I will continue to encourage them to have confidence in these institutions that we have built, have confidence in our people, and to take the symbolic step of full decolonization. Time come. No, she has not. No, she has not. She has not. I don't know why she hasn't, but she had, you know, disclosure is what I've been clamoring for. I wrote to her in June last year with some questions when she first reached out to me with a letter asking me to appoint people to two representatives from the opposition to this committee. I responded with a substantive letter raising 3 issues. She did not reply to that letter, despite me sending her a follow-up letter asking for that reply a month later or thereabouts. She did not reply to that letter until last week, Thursday. And then in that letter, she again asked me to appoint people by the beginning of this week. And so I had to reply to her again and say, listen, we want clarity and disclosure as to the road you're proposing to take the country when it comes to the Charter of Rights and how you want to amend it. What are those things? And when it comes to deeply entrenched provisions that you want to put amendments to the population under a referendum, where are you going? I want to understand what your thinking is on these issues. Let's have a discussion. And I want that in writing from her. As to why she is ambivalent or whatever her position is on the full decolonization, all I've heard from her is we don't have consensus on that at this time. I have heard no reasons as to why that's so.
Okay, I have another question here from Siobhan Campbell again. If a removal of the visa requirement to access the UK Privy Council is achieved, would you find that as an acceptable substitute?
Clearly not. That is just adding insult to injury, the requirement for a visa. But the costs of going to the UK are prohibitive, and the principle is objectionable. After 60 years of independence, having established a court which is highly regarded around the world, and which more and more of the Caribbean jurisdictions are acceding to as their final court. When we are moving to fully or to decolonize Jamaica once and for all, we cannot continue to have our final court being a colonial court in London. The visa issue, as I've said, is just an exacerbation of how bad it is, but in principle. And as I've said before, this is nothing to do with the quality of those judges, the English judges who sit. They're excellent jurists, but that's not the point.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.